Well, I want to welcome you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to this third webinar in our Engaging Eurasia Teacher Fellowship. It's wonderful to see you all joining us again, and as always, I'm happy when you can and join us from conferences and after work, and it's just super dedication that I respect. Before we begin today's lecture and before I introduce our speaker, Dr. Sarah Cameron, I would just like to take a brief moment to share some news, which I've already shared with you on Basecamp. We are pleased to welcome 5 new teacher fellows. It's a little bit late to the program, but they've all, agreed to watch the other 2 recordings and make up the readings. And we wanted to offer this chance to expand because we cannot do the in-person workshop this year, but also because a couple of our teacher fellows had to leave the fellowship. So we wanted to make sure that we have as full attendance as possible. And there's some noise that I'm hearing. I'm not sure what's going on. Okay. So I would welcome you to, or I would like you to welcome with me our today's speaker, Dr. Sarah Cameron. She's a historian of Russia and Soviet Union, whose work explores genocide and crimes against humanity, environmental history, and the societies of Central Asia. She's the author of the award-winning book, The Hungry Steppe: Famine, Violence, and the Making of Soviet Kazakhstan, which examines the largely overlooked Kazakh famine of 1930 to 1933. Dr. Cameron is currently working on her second book, The Aral Sea, Environment, Society, and State Power in Central Asia, a groundbreaking study of one of the 20th century's worst environmental disasters. Her research challenges the idea that the sea crisis was solely a Soviet tragedy, highlighting the role of multiple global actors and the human cost of unsustainable cotton production. So Dr. Cameron today will share her insights from this ongoing work in this presentation titled Elusive Water, the Life and Death of the Central Asia's Aral Sea. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Cameron. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Greetings to everyone from just outside of DC. I'm sorry that I'm not able to meet all of you in person. Uh, and I'd like to begin by thanking Sandra for her efforts to organize this talk. I'm really happy also with the theme that you're studying this year. It's such an important theme for my field more generally, and I see so much energy and initiative. It is one of the biggest kind of themes emerging out of scholarship on the region today. And there's just so much ground to cover, I can say. There's a lot of work to do. So it's wonderful that you'll have to have the chance to engage with this theme from so many different angles this year. So, as Sandra said, I'll be speaking to you today about my research on the causes and consequences of one of the 20th and 21st centuries' worst environmental catastrophes, the disappearance of the Aral Sea. You may be wondering, where is that? Don't worry, there will be many maps. I'll show them to you. I do want to stress at the outset that this is really a work in progress that I'm presenting to you, that I'm still working on this book. I've got a couple chapters drafted, done most of the research, but not all of it. And so I really do welcome any comments, criticisms, points of confusion, suggestions. Please bring it on. I'm also curious to see what interests people, actually. What do you find interesting in this story? Because there are a lot of different threads in it. So let me bring up my PowerPoint here. Okay, so can everyone see the PowerPoint? Okay, great. So I thought I'd first begin before I get into the talk by explaining this image, and you're going to see a lot of photos in the talk. One of the great advantages of this project is that so my first book, I should say, was about nomadism in the 1930s in Kazakhstan. Not a lot of images there. I showed the same ones over and over again, about the same 5 images. This book, I took a lot of these photos myself, almost all of them actually, And there are just so many amazing images. So this photo I took in June 2024 on the Kazakhstani side of the Aral Sea because fishing is a big theme in my project, and I decided that, look, I'm going to write about fishing. I better actually understand how it's done. So I went out in the evening with the fishermen, helped them, watch them set the nets, and then we went out when dawn broke at 4 a.m. to actually look in the nets to bring in the nets and see what fish was caught. I can tell you that it was very beautiful, extraordinarily beautiful, but also a bit scary because these boats were kind of rickety and mine like had a motor that wouldn't restart. It was kind of choppy. I thought maybe that's the end of me here in the Aral Sea writing about this book. But I'm happy to report that I survived and here I am. And I learned a lot about fishing from that experience too. So with this, I'll begin my talk. Let's see. Uh, all right. Okay. Um, so first, I promised you a map, of course. Um, and the story really begins with the sea, because in many senses, the sea itself is really a central character in my book. The Aral is located at the endpoint of two ancient rivers, which you can see more clearly here. They're the Sirdarya and the Amu Darya. You might have heard of the Oxus, and so on. These are very ancient. Those were older names for some of these rivers. These rivers originate in the high mountain chains of Asia, and they're fed by glaciers, and they wind their way all the way across much of Central Asia, as you can see here on the map, before terminating in the Aral. So actually, the Aral is not technically a sea. That's a misnomer to refer to it as a sea. It is actually an endohaic lake, or a lake with no outflow. In general, the climate here, the days are long, sunny, cloudless. Rainfall is not plentiful. So, any rain that falls quickly evaporates into the air. And so we might think of these two rivers as actually kind of the sea's lifelines. They're like the blue chains that determine whether it lives or whether it exists. So, one point also you might guess from looking at this map is that power in part flows not from the north to the south, right? We might think of that in a colonial model, but power is in part tied to resources, in this case, water, and the way that water flows, because water is not flowing here from the north to the south, but from the southeast to the northwest. Um, to orient you here a little bit on geography, if I want to go, I'll go back a bit. The remains of the sea today covers two present-day states. So this is a map prior to the retreat, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And then you can see if you go forward here that part of the delta of the sea actually covers Turkmenistan, a third state. And these are the three states that are going to be part of my story today, and I'll return to them later in the talk. Another thing I should point you to orient you is that the Aral Sea is a salt lake, and that is a body of water that's usually found in arid environments. Its concentration really differs because from freshwater because it has a high concentration of salt and other minerals, and salt lakes are really reactive. We might think of them as like canaries in the coal mine. So they tell us something that we can't see, maybe human intervention, some sort of anthropogenic change, environmental change, almost before we sense it. And it's really not a coincidence. If we look globally, you might think, oh, Salt Lake, Great Salt Lake. You'd be right, right? That is a salt lake, as you might expect. Some of you may know that the Great Salt Lake is also under threat. There are other examples of this. One would be, the Dead Sea, Lake Urmia in Iran, Lake Chad. Um, so the Aral Sea, in some senses, is part of a pattern, although it has its own distinctive features. And I'll return to that theme again at the end of my talk. I also want to call attention to the fact that I've referred to the Aral as an elusive body of water. I put that in the title of my talk. And I do that to call attention to the fact that due to changes, both natural and anthropogenic, the waters of the Aral Sea have risen and fallen over the course of its history. And so you'll notice in my slide, for it to go back to the beginning here, I call attention to the modern retreat of the sea. And that's because if we look back into the deep history of the Aral, there have actually been other retreats of the sea as well. But in the 1960s, arguably, we begin to see something really striking. And that is the Soviets begin to divert these two rivers that feed the sea, those two kind of lifelines that I pointed out to you, Amudarya and the Sirdarya, to boost cotton production. And so the sea begins to dry up in a way that seems really different than previous shifts. The climate, ecology of the region changes. We see dust storms, also an upsurge in health problems, particularly ones that affect women and children. And in addition, the fishing industry collapses here. This shot is from the period, an example of some of the fish that were caught in the sea. But of course, as the sea begins to dry up, the fishing is no longer possible to do fishing. And this story, really, the Aral Sea story, continues in many respects. Oops. Let's see. Continues in many respects into the post-Soviet era. And that's, you can see just very dramatically here from this Encyclopedia Britannica street, shot, just how much of the sea has been lost. In fact, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, in 2017 calls it, quote, probably the biggest ecological catastrophe of our time. So this Aral Sea disaster, causes and consequences. This is the subject of this book that I'm working on now. Rather than framing the Aral Sea as the sort of short-term product of the Soviet cotton boom, it seeks to explain how and why the people of the sea came to be marginalized. And it analyzes how this process occurred over three different systems of rule. So Russian Imperial, Soviet, and post-Soviet. And I try in my book to really place the people of the region at the heart of the story. So I want to give you an overview here of my talk today. So I want to talk first a little bit about, so what have people said about this disaster? How has it been understood to date? And then in turn, secondly, how is my approach different? Then in the last part of my talk, I want to take you kind of deep dive into the sources and give you a little bit of a sense of what they look like. And then at the end, I will introduce some broader conclusions that I think we can draw from this story. So turning to the first part, how has the demise of the sea been explained? Well, I can say from a sort of historian standpoint and from an archival standpoint, there's very, very little literature on this. I can talk more about the nitty-gritty of what has been written, but there's almost nothing I can say in terms of something that's archivally based about the Aral Sea. But I think the way generally the Aral Sea has been viewed in the West is the way that sort of Al Gore, who was someone who visited the region, actually, who calls attention to it. As you can see here, it was sort of framed as the paradigmatic Soviet environmental crime, something that was understood to symbolize what was seen in the West as the Soviet Union's uniquely destructive relationship with the natural world. Inside the Soviet Union, the sea's retreat is depicted largely as a successful effort to bend nature to the needs of Soviet modernization. This was, for some, a success story, that cotton becomes king, that the Soviet Union becomes this amazing cotton superpower by 1983. And even you have some water experts saying, well, that sea, it needs to die like a soldier on the field of battle. But really, I would argue that in both versions of the story, Soviet and Western, the profound effects of the crisis on the people who live around the sea, particularly, some of the things I mentioned already, economic dislocation, cultural destruction, devastating impacts on human health, have largely been ignored. And one key effect of this is that the sea's demise becomes envisaged really as an environmental crisis, not a human one. So I've often found, a significant number of people in the US, or a good number, I can say that, people have vaguely heard of the Aral Sea catastrophe. But even the ones who haven't, I say to them, I say, have you seen those photos of those ships in the sand? And oh, okay, I know what I know what you mean. And I would argue that, returning to my point about, the fact that this has been represented as an environmental crisis, we can see how this is even represented on a visual level. That we see ships adrift in the sand, and we see places without people. The people are not put into the story. And if you think about how climate change is represented more generally, this is actually quite typical that I would argue that in the media we see people emphasize the physical impacts of climate change, the loss of sea ice, damage to coral reefs, and the people affected. Actually, many of them, members of the global south or indigenous groups, are often missing. So, turning to the second part of my talk, how do I approach telling this story? Um, Before I delve into that, I just want to point out to you here I am standing on this nature preserve. Used to be an island. It's called the Place of No Return. There's all these kind of conspiracy theories about what supposedly happens on this island. I did return, but if you look down there, you can see the remains of an old Soviet fishing ship. Right, you can get a sense of how it shrunk into the land, and also this preserve used to be an island is actually now become part of the shore, excuse me. So the second way that I try to tell this story is I want to try to step away a bit from the national frames in which such stories are usually told. I'm really interested in the story of how water, its presence or absence, plays a major role in forming some of the identities in the region. It also might help us explain why we see such striking differences between the two kind of national halves of the sea. There's remains of the sea in two states, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, but they actually look really different. So I became interested in that question of why and how this happened. The conventional one point to back up, I got ahead of myself. I wanted to point out that one way I try to do the story differently is I tell the story in longue durée. So here's a chapter overview. You can see from this, I start in the Russian imperial era, and I take it all the way up to the present day. I have two chapters after the Soviet collapse. So I do that as a way to kind of de-exceptionalize the Soviet experience, and also look at at how some of these ideas, even about draining the sea, even had roots in the Russian Empire. And I also, you can see it really if we return to this map for a minute. For me, this is also one of the most striking visual images in my project. In that, if you look at the first line, the top line there, that is the Soviet era. You look at the second line, that is post 1991. Look at how much water uh, gets drained post 1991. So clearly, we cannot say that this is just a Soviet story, right? Clearly, something major is happening after the collapse in 1991. So it's just even looking at these images visually that made me realize, gosh, the sort of conventional wisdom that this is just something about the Soviet Union, that's probably not correct. So returning to the point that I was just I was explaining before is I wanted the second way I want to tell this story that's a bit different is I want to step away from the kind of national frames that these stories are told in, and I'm interested in how water, its presence or absence, actually played a role in crafting some of the identities in the region, right? Why we see these differences on the Kazakhstani and Uzbekistani sides. So usually the kind of main answer for why we see these differences on the Kazakhstani versus Uzbekistani side is, well, people really point to the fact that actually, you know, the Kazakhstani side is doing better because they built a dam in 2005. But I'm a historian. I don't accept that answer. And actually, I believe that the differences that we see between these two sides actually have much longer roots. So how do I do that? Well, one major point is my book is not just about the sea itself. It's about a region that I call the lands around the sea. This area is what Russian imperial geographers referred to as the Aral, or the lands near the sea. And I would argue it's less an exact place than really an idea. You know, something that is defined, a location that is defined by its relationship with water. It includes the oasis area of the Amu Darya Delta. That would be kind of the southern part of the sea that you can see there, which extends down into part of Turkmenistan. And it also includes the Kazakh steppe. You can see the Syr Darya on the map there. this portion of the Kazakh steppe through which the Sir Daria runs. I will, please forgive me, by the way, for my kind of magic marker outlines here. I face a really big problem in this project with maps because I'm talking about an area that I will be frank, even some of my colleagues who work on Central Asia don't really know very well. It's a very rural area. It's a very vast area, I should also stress. It's about the size of the state of Texas, just for kind of a general comparison. It's very rugged and difficult to access. So I actually went out to some of these rugged areas, which was really amazing. This is one of the physical barriers, the Ustyurt Plateau, that sort of makes the region kind of difficult to get to. There are also deserts in parts of the region. And this geographic isolation is important because it meant that this area was very difficult for outside powers to conquer. But also, as you might imagine, the geographic isolation could also be really generative. It could lead to these explosions of sort of creativity and achievement. And if we look historically, the Oasis region, for instance, around the Amu Darya Delta, is really important in generating a Turkic literary language and culture. So this is again more shots of sort of the isolation of the region. So in my book, I'm really interested in the kind of shifting national designations in this region, how they took shape over the Soviet era. So for instance, all of these national designations were something that were done in the Soviet era. There was no Kazakhstan, there was no Uzbekistan prior to the advent of Soviet rule. But in fact, the boundaries of this region, the region that I'm studying, these lands around the Aral Sea, they flip back and forth. Originally, the Aral Sea is actually wholly in Kazakhstan, that it gets moved and gets divided up in two. I'm also interested in a story within this, which is there's a group that live within Uzbekistan. They're a Turkic-speaking group called the Karakalpaks. And I'm really interested in how and why they don't end up getting their own republic, why it is that they end up being housed within Uzbekistan, and the Karakalpaks also become maybe the group that's most closely associated with the disaster because they're an ethnic group. The entirety of the Karakalpaks is affected by this disaster, so it's a very much a national issue, and they're housed within Uzbekistan, a system that still exists to this day, and this leads to a lot of tensions, I can say. So I argue that more generally, by the 1940s, we see new borders settling into place, and this region that I study becomes kind of like a double periphery. So it's isolated from Moscow, but it's also isolated within Central Asia because it's far away from the capitals of these republics. So you can see them here on the map: Turkmenistan, Tashkent. This is a present day map, so it shows the capital of Kazakhstan is Astana, but during the Soviet period, it was Alma-Ata, Almaty, which you can see down there in the south. So this is quite a kind of isolated region in many senses, isolated from the halls of power. So the term Prioral, the original term for the region, becomes associated with disaster. So, the third and final way I try to tell this story a bit differently is that I'm really interested in elevating the voices of ordinary people, particularly rural people in Central Asia, who I think, have really been underrepresented in the literature to date. So I did a ton of archival research for this project. I've actually traveled to all three countries that are part of this story, and that one of them I should really highlight is Turkmenistan. So, some of you may not know, but Turkmenistan is one of the most difficult countries in the world to get a visa to. I believe that I was one of the kind of first Western scholars to visit this country, or one of the very few in recent years. And I didn't get into the archives. I wasn't expecting that, but the fact that I got I got a visa was a huge victory, and it also gave me a lot of insight, I would say, into how issues of climate and environment are handled there. I've also, so beyond visiting all of these places, I've also spent a lot of time in rural Central Asia. You know, I've been out on the fishing boats, I've been camping out in yurts, sat out for long rides across parts of this area because what happened when the sea retreated is that many of these fishing villages were once connected to the sea by water, but the sea retreats, and so these fishing villages become essentially like islands in the desert. You know, they have no road systems, they're not connected to anything, so you need a four-wheel drive to access them. So I'll show you one example of this. This is the abandoned settlement of Akespe. And the whole village, actually, because of climate change around the sea, they were actually forced, to move. And so what they did was the whole village moved wholesale. So there's old Akaspe and now there's a new Akaspe. So they just simply took the name and moved. So what did all this work and talking to ordinary people do? It really helped me correct this mistaken impression that the sea's demise is purely an environmental crisis rather than a human one. If you talk to people who live in the region, it's clear that it was a human catastrophe in addition to an environmental one. That it had, sweeping impacts on human health, cultural destruction, and so on. Here's another example of an interview I did. This has really helped me show that the environmental story can't be told without the human one, that we really can't, it's a very artificial separation that these two versions of the story, the Soviet and the Western one, have implied, and that I try to show how the environmental and the human, nature and culture, are deeply and inextricably intertwined. So turning now to part three, um, I want to take a deeper dive into the sources and the process of marginalization that I detailed at the outset. I'll tell you about a piece of my project from chapter 5, and that discusses how did they define the disaster zone? How did they define what this disaster was and its kind of geographic extent? So here you can see this. I found a lot of amazing sources for this project, and I'll show you one here, just so you can get a sense of what the documents look like. This is a woman, a female pediatrician. She's writing a letter to Gorbachev. She is a woman from this affected area. She identifies herself as a pediatrician, and she goes into a lot of detail about what is happening around the Aral Sea. And she also says, look, the Aral Sea has just not gotten the same attention from the center as the 1986 Chernobyl explosion in Ukraine. And I do want to flag Chernobyl here because I will return to that theme. I think the comparison with Chernobyl is really important, both for scholars and it was important to people in the region at the time. So she catalogs here a really astonishing array of health issues that people in the region are suffering. And she also includes here some pretty gruesome photographs of children. And I didn't want to show those to you for kind of obvious reasons, but I can assure you that they are quite horrible. So there's no response from Gorbachev in the file that I read. I didn't know if he'd ever gotten a chance to see the photos and how he reacted, but I can tell you, I think this lady knew what she was doing. Because if you talk about sick children, that signals a kind of total breakdown of the party's promises to uplift and transform society. Children were always depicted kind of as the future of communism. But of course, what kind of future awaits people who live around the sea if their kids look like that? So if we're thinking about the rule of Gorbachev, in some ways, this letter is very kind of emblematic of that period because Gorbachev's rule permits a discussion of a much wider range of topics. You have all kinds of secrets and things bursting into view, and the Aral Sea is part of that. So in 1988, we see them recognizing the catastrophic health effects of the disaster for the first time. And they also begin to discuss, Soviet experts begin to discuss what might have caused the health effects. And that is a debate that, by the way, continues to this day. We have people saying that it was in part because people were drinking poor water, right? People are downstream. There's defoliants chemicals coming through this water. Some people say it's because of the dust that people are breathing in, polluted air. Also, the food basis is declining at this point, like livestock, cattle, and so on are dying, vegetables. You also have an uglier discussion where you even have some Russian scientists saying, so-called scientists, saying, look, the people of this region, they brought this on themselves. That they actually had too many kids. They point to the high birth rate in the region, and they say they did this to themselves. The work begins in this period on a process to delineate the disaster zone, and think about kind of rights or what would be given to people who live there, in part because people want compensation for what they had endured. If you lived in the disaster zone, that meant things like pay, vacation time. The disaster zone also, this discussion becomes important because no one can seem to agree on what else to do. So the Soviet Union and many of these states are deeply dependent on cotton. So there's no serious discussion about reducing the cotton acreage. There's a separate proposal to divert waters of Siberia to save the sea. That gets also bogged down. The project is canceled. There's even proposals for cloud seeding, actually, to create artificial rainfall. But some of the mountainous countries in Central Asia don't want that because they believe it's going to cause avalanches. So just to show you also here more what some of the sources look like, this was my major source for this portion of the project. This really interesting collection of documents, this sort of investigative commission, which includes documents from these three republics on the making of a disaster zone. And they eventually decide on a version of the disaster zone that combines both environmental health metrics, so things like water salinity, with human health metrics. So, what happens is that this disaster zone proposal basically gives voice to anguish and human suffering that had long been dismissed. And residents begin to lobby for being in the disaster zone. You can see one here where this guy he's actually excluded from the kind of initial working definition of the disaster zone, and he's writing a petition and saying, hey, I need to be put back into the disaster zone. You have no idea kind of what's going on here. We also see different republics actually jockeying and trying to get ahead of Moscow. So Turkmenistan tries to argue that they're the worst affected. They actually declare preemptively, without waiting for Moscow, that parts of the republic are an ecological disaster zone. So I want to return to the story of the Karakalpaks. So the Karakalpaks, just to remind you, they are this Turkic-speaking ethnic group, an ethnic minority within Uzbekistan, and they don't get their own republic. But in point of fact, the story of the Karakalpaks and the story of this small, kind of tiny nation on the southern portion is very much intertwined with the sea. So they also try to argue that they are the worst affected. Um, uh, uh, they argue that, look, only in Karakalpakstan is this disaster so intertwined with the fate of a national group. And in point of fact, I would argue that the disaster, even to this day, comes to play a huge role in what it means actually to be Karakalpak, that you are in part the victim of, you live in a disaster zone and you are a victim of a disaster. So you might be asking me here, you're saying, well, this is disaster zone proposal. It ties money to claims of human health problems. How do we know that these are real? And I think if you go around the region, there's many ways to catalog that this is real. So we can kind of cross-check it with the party's own information from this time, which I have, and the statistics are quite horrifying. I can also cross-check it anecdotally with conversations that I had with people in the region, and I found it really poignant, actually, how many people I talked to would tuck in, just almost like mentioning kind of like a side way that it didn't matter, that they'd lost some kids in childbirth or they'd had a child who didn't make it to their first birthday. And even if you go actually to some of the cemeteries in the region here, which I did, you can see rows and rows of tiny children's graves. So Um, different strategies emerge on different lines. So what Karakol Pakistan in these discussions for resources, Karakol Pakistan and Kazakhstan really come to emphasize the cultural and economic impact of the sea's disappearance, even though these are not formally recognized in the disaster zone proposal. They stress, in particular, the need for the preservation and the defense of the Aral. They talk about the harm to the fishermen and so on. And groups of writers in particular. There's a wonderful kind of literary story here, I think, as well. They publish very evocative memoir and literary accounts of the sea that dramatize the stories of the fishermen and call attention to the fate of the Aral. So this framing, I think, has important emotional appeal, but also important consequences because as the disaster comes to be more closely associated with the sea itself, rather than the far-reaching consequences of the disaster, Turkmenistan falls out of the story. And in fact, many people, even those who have, might know something about the Aral Sea story, when I tell them, no, 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 Turkmenistan's part of the story, they're very surprised, actually, because they associate the disaster really closely with the sea itself. And of course, if we look historically, the people who lived in this part of northern Turkmenistan, they were closely connected. Actually, they had important connections to the waters of the Aral Sea. So as the disaster goes on, late Soviet period, we see another phenomenon surface. This is also really important to this story, and that is climate migration. So a disaster zone proposal assumes that people are fixed in place. It's a proposal about defining boundaries geographically. But of course, what happens as the environmental conditions worsen and as the sea dries up is that people begin to flee. So you see one example of this, a very poignant episode. This guy, a Kazakh, who's named a hero of socialist labor in 1971 for his efforts in fishing. Well, as the sea dries up, he ends up actually being unemployed. And, he goes to Alma-Ata, then Kazakhstan's capital, in search of work. And we see also other people fleeing. A lot of people go to the capitals, to places like Ashgabat, capital of Turkmenistan, Alma-Ata, capital of Kazakhstan. The Karakalpaks, this Turkic-speaking ethnic group that I mentioned earlier, many of them actually go to Kazakhstan because Karakalpak culture is very close to Kazakh culture. They're both formerly nomadic societies, and there was even debate in the Soviet era, about whether they could be seen as distinct nationalities or whether they were the same group. So they don't actually flee within Uzbekistan, they actually cross into a different country. In Turkmenistan, in particular, and this gets at some of the very real research project challenges in this project, I couldn't get into the Turkmen archives. It was also not really possible for me to do oral history research in the conventional way in Turkmenistan because many people are quite frightened, and rightly so, of state repression. But one thing I did do was I did actually oral history interviews with some of the Turkmen diaspora who live abroad. And they would also tell me stories of migration, and this is how I got at the migration angle on the Turkmen side. They would tell me stories of, coming from the region affected by this disaster. Um, they would flee to Ashgabat, to Turkmenistan's capital, and be examined by a doctor for health problems. The doctor would say, I can tell you from Dashabus, from this affected area, because they would look at the patient's kidneys, for instance, and they could guess exactly where they were from because many people in this disaster, for instance, developed huge problems with kidney problems and kidney stone problems. So, meanwhile, officials in the region, they continue to haggle over the financial details of the proposed disaster zone. Many clearly understand that this is just a band-aid on a larger problem. All it does, in many senses, is it offers people rewards to take risks with their health. And this is, of course, an idea that has a much longer genealogy in both capitalist and communist societies. In fact, the head of Kazakhstan's Committee for Hydrometeorology says, look, unless we radically change the water supply to the sea, everything else he writes is just wasting time. And a delay here is as good as death. But it's also not clear that at this point, when the Soviet Union is on the verge of collapse, that people had a lot of choice. They were just trying to extract what they could. And indeed, time did run out. The Soviet Union was dissolved on December 26, 1991, and the Soviet version of this disaster zone proposal, which they were busy debating, it's actually never finalized in the Soviet era. So, with that, I want to turn to my conclusions. And this here you can see is a shot of the Uzbekistani side of the sea, really difficult to get to. I probably traveled by, I don't know, 6, 7 hours by four-wheel drive vehicle to get this shot. But I also show you some of these photographs also to kind of counter and to play with the image that I think, we see so many images of disaster, ships in the sand, but I also want to show you how beautiful actually parts of this region are. So I just told you that the Soviet disaster zone proposal doesn't end up happening. So I want to ask from that, what conclusions, what might this particular part of the story then tell us? It doesn't happen in the Soviet era. And what does the Aral story reveal more generally? So, one, I should point out that the Aral Sea disaster zone proposal actually has a pretty important afterlife in each of the three states that are part of the story. So, Turkmenistan, there is no longer any recognized disaster zone in the country. That the sea's disappearance is not really acknowledged as a problem, which is sort of consistent with the approach of many Turkmenistani authorities to problems in Turkmenistan more generally. This is a country that the official line is we don't really have any problems. Um, uh, but in Kazakhstan, we see a different approach, which is they actually adopt the Soviet version of the disaster zone wholesale. You can see here an image from the archives. This is really fresh from the archives. I took this shot about a month ago in the National Archives in Kazakhstan. And you can get a sense here of, you can see the shading. The darker shading is when you get closer to the sea, and so they have three zones here, and the zone closest to the sea is declared to be, the worst affected. And basically, if you're a state employee in any of these zones, you get, better pensions, you get higher pay, and so on. So it continues the system of giving people rewards for taking risks with their health. In Uzbekistan, we see a really different approach. And I do want to highlight again that this issue of tensions with the Karakalpak minority who live around the sea, that these most recently erupted in 2022, where there were actually riots that broke out. And a good number of people were killed. It's unclear how many. And this was over proposed changes to Uzbekistan's constitution, which would have made it impossible for Karakalpakstan to secede because that nominally retains the right to secede right now. So what do they do with the disaster zone there? Well, they made it into a tourist site. It is a site for kind of so-called dark tourism. You can see the ships here. I took the shot. This is the so-called ship graveyard. Point of fact, this is not actually even the port, this spot here. They took these ships from where the sea retreated from all over the area, and they kind of lined them up neatly here. This, I was told, was done because the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the time was coming to the region, and his sort of advanced team came and said, "Oh my gosh, he wants to see ships. He wants to see ships." So now they had to rearrange it into a way that was visible to him. The other thing that they have done is that they have declared the Aral Sea Disaster Zone to be a zone of ecological innovation and technologies. This is kind of dramatic rebrand, if you will, of the Soviet disaster zone idea. On one level, it is about assistance. It's about introducing things like tree planting, water saving technologies. But I would also argue if you look at some of this language and if you think about what innovation might also mean, it might also, if you think about it critically, mean erasure, right? Erasure of old traditions, erasure of culture, and so on. Um, I want to return back also to sort of the broader theme of the disaster zone. Another theme that I want to return to in the conclusion is how long it took them to officially recognize the Aral Sea disaster. As I mentioned, the sea begins shrinking in the 1960s. They don't recognize it until 1988. And if we think about the contrast with Chernobyl, other interesting observations emerge. Both of these disasters are environmental and human disasters. They have catastrophic environmental effects, catastrophic human effects, but Chernobyl is recognized really as a public health story right away. The disaster is delineated right after the explosion in 1986, but the Aral Sea story struggles to be recognized as a public health story. Indeed, this was the greatest surprise for me getting into this project, that I was dealing with a public health story. And this is a point of tension to this day, actually, that it's really kind of not seen in that way. I would also argue that these documents, the disaster zone documents, help us kind of correct this impression of Central Asia as always subservient to Moscow. If you look at these documents more closely, it really sort of questions the idea that Central Asia wanted to hang on to the last minute. Well, if they wanted to do that, they had good reasons for it, which is that they needed money to clean up this mess. And I think, more broadly, that may kind of call into the question another kind of trope in the literature, which is that Central Asia was always heavily subsidized by Moscow. Because I think if you look at this disaster, you might say, well, what does subsidy even mean? In this context, right? When we see this level of kind of human suffering. In general, I would argue the story also that I've tried to tell is perhaps a little bit different than most of the Soviet environmental history literature, which has stressed kind of the overweening presence of the state. Here, the issue is not so much state presence, but actually rather state absence, or the underdevelopment of the region, the absence of modern medical services, running water, or even electricity. I would argue that we see distinctive aspects to the Aral Sea case, right? Like this emphasis on building up cotton production in a very quick period of time to catch up and overtake the capitalist West. But consigning the Aral Sea disaster to the past as something purely Soviet also neglects the fact that it's not a completely unique story. What I gestured to at the beginning of my talk, we see common features in all of these cases. We might see the Aral Sea case in many respects as a harbinger of our own future. Turning back, and this is the final point, to the broader climate change literature, I think the people of the Aral have something to teach us as well. When we think of climate change, it's often, I would argue, kind of portrayed as an elegy. And I want to return to this picture of ships in the sand to show you what I mean. That taken on their own, not knowing anything more about the story, we might comprehend these pictures, images of ships in the sand, images that don't have people, as an expression of loss and sorrow. They suggest that the end of the story is known. And this is often, too, also representative, I would argue, of how accounts of climate change in the global south are often framed, because local people are not highlighted. The implication is that these people, many of them indigenous or otherwise marginalized groups, that they collapsed, that they fled in the face of radical environmental change. But if we take a closer look at the history of the people around the sea, we see, in fact, that they've taken deep root. There are many people who are very anxious to stay there and to live there. And we certainly see accounts of loss and sorrow, but we also see something very different as well. We see stories of energy, adaptation, and hope. And by spotlighting local voices, that is what I seek to highlight in my book. And with this, I want to close with this image of the fishing boat that I got to travel on, which is where I began my talk. Thank you.